cannot simply rely on the idea that complex molecular structures emerge only by chance. There must be a principle or a law that guides the assembly of these molecular fragments into more complex formations. This process of self-organization takes place in particular conditions, far from equilibrium, where systems can form orderly structures, fed by continuous flows of energy and matter. These are the words of the scientist Ilya Prigogine, Nobel Prize winner for chemistry in 1977, who has long wondered about the origin of life. According to the scientist's vision, the case alone is not enough to explain the complexity and order we observe in nature. There must be principles unknown to us that guide the formation of complex systems and make the improbability of certain events more probable and understandable. If, in fact, in the 1950s and 1970s there was great enthusiasm in believing that the origin of life was the result of a series of fortunate casual events, today the same scientific research is less and less certain that life can only be the result of this fortunate combination. Something seems to escape our understanding. But why is it so difficult to understand the origin of life? Often this question sees two opposing sides. Those who believe that life is the result of an evolutionary progression, those who, on the other hand, see the impossibility that everything is the result of chance, and oppose the thesis of intelligent design. But why today, in an era dominated by science, is it still difficult to answer this question clearly? The mystery of the origin of life, at least for the moment, is closely linked to the history of our planet. We know that the Earth is just under 5 billion years old, and in the course of this time, it has transformed from a roaring sphere to the planet we know today. The existence of the Homo sapiens represents only a very short segment of this long history. If we compare the history of the Earth to a single day of 24 hours, humanity would only have appeared in the last 30 milliseconds. To try to answer the question of how life originated, we must inevitably go back in time and travel to an ever more remote and mysterious past in which life and the Earth are very different from those that appear to us today. If in fact we travel back up to 200 million years, we will find a land where the first dinosaurs have recently appeared. Dinosaurs that, in the years to come, would have dominated the planet. This ancient world in some ways resembles ours, but it already has some interesting differences. For example, we may notice the absence of grass, flowers, or fruits. The dominant plants are in fact conifers, but despite these differences, we will have no problem recognizing life. If we go back in time even further and travel up to 400 million years, we will find a world with a warmer climate, populated by strange shrubs similar to mushrooms. The mainland would be inhabited mainly by insects, and in the waters of the oceans, we will find strange creatures, placoderms, fish armed with large jaws. But let's go even further back. 600 million years ago, the situation on Earth would appear very different. The planet has just come out of an ice age, the air is still breathable, but on the mainland we will find almost nothing. Instead, the seas would be populated by tiny algae. And if we went even further back, life existed, but it was much simpler. There were bacteria, as evidenced by the ancient rocks called stromatolites, formed by the sedimentation of bacterial colonies. These structures are still present today in some environments, such as certain areas in Australia. These forms of elementary life have dominated the Earth for billions of years, remaining at microscopic levels and unorganized for a long time. So going back in time, we can notice a sort of evolution of life, from simple beings to more complex beings, which could lead to thinking that life has traveled an evolutionary path, and that at an imprecise moment, the inert matter has mutated into life. Following this path, this seems to be the most logical way, but in reality there is a problem. When we go in search of the origins of life, what we can do is look for the last universal common antenna. Despite the varied diversity of life that populates our planet, the fundamental mechanisms underlying life are surprisingly similar. All living beings have cells that contain DNA, a complex molecule that contains the instructions that regulate the functioning of the organism. However, it is a great mystery how we manage to go from simple molecules to complex systems. Over the years, science has tried to explain this mechanism, but we are sure that this explanation satisfies our expectations. The most accredited theory that explains this passage is that of abiogenesis. According to this theory, life can originate from inorganic substances through natural processes without the intervention of living organisms. In other words, life would spontaneously emerge from non-living molecules in primordial conditions on Earth. This is a very old idea. In the past, in fact, it was thought that life could spontaneously arise in certain conditions. For example, before the modern understanding of biology, it was believed that worms were spontaneously born from decomposing meat, or that mice emerged from moldy grains. In the 19th century, experiments like those of Louis Pasteur proved, however, that life cannot spontaneously arise, and that a piece of rotten meat is not enough to give birth to worms. But with the discovery of the incredible world of the microscope, the idea that inert matter could turn into life, or at least be able to form the foundations of life, has risen again. And to prove this theory, many experiments are carried out. In the laboratory, the conditions of primordial Earth are recreated, or at least what is thought to have been. And from these initial conditions, the first biological molecules are tried to be created. The most famous experiment is certainly that of Miller. In this experiment, the scientists used water, methane, ammonia, and hydrogen, and exposed this mixture to electric shocks to simulate the thunderstorms of the atmosphere. A week after the experiment, Miller found that the mixture irradiated by electric energy had produced several amino acids, which are the bricks of the proteins and essential components for life as we know it. So have we managed to recreate life in the laboratory? Not exactly. The experiment has shown that in specific conditions, spontaneous formation of organic molecules is possible. But to get to the complexity of what we call life, several steps are still missing. It is necessary, in fact, that the amino acids bind together to form longer chains called polypeptides or proteins, a process that requires special conditions and which is still not clear how it can be done. In addition to proteins, life as we know it requires nucleic acids, DNA and RNA, to store and transmit genetic information. The spontaneous formation of RNA and DNA is a complex process, and even this is not fully understood at the moment. For life, it is also essential to have a separate environment, like a cell, where chemical reactions can occur. This implies the formation of cellular membranes or lipids that can self-assemble into structures similar to vesicles. One of the fundamental characteristics of life is the ability to replicate. This requires not only the presence of nucleic acids, but also a mechanism to accurately copy these molecules and transmit genetic information to the next generation. Finally, for diversification and adaptation, it is necessary a mechanism through which organisms can change over time, such as mutation and natural selection. At the moment, it can be said that we have managed to understand how technically the origin of life could have been possible, but how all this actually happened, we still do not know. So, what prompted the creation of increasingly complex molecules? And all this can originate from the simple case. To simplify, let us take the famous example of the letters of the alphabet and admit that the elements that make up the molecules are the letters. To formulate complex molecules, we need them to make up words of computed meaning, then sentences, and finally an entire book. If we now throw these letters on a table, it is possible that they, sooner or later, will be able to compose a word, a sentence, and an entire book of computed meaning. This, even if we admit that we have a lot of time, seems unlikely. However, scientists have made another discovery. Always remaining on the example of the letters of the alphabet, they have discovered that they follow precise orders. That is, some letters are linked to others. So we know that it is possible to compose consonants, but how to compose words, sentences, and an entire book is not yet clear. At this point, anyone looking for a technical explanation of how life was formed can be satisfied. Going back in time, we have understood which molecules make it possible. The exact procedure on how these are aggregated, we still do not know, or rather we know that some molecules are more likely to bind to each other than others because of their chemical properties. Those looking for the reason why life was formed and why simple elements have combined with each other to create the improbable complexity of life cannot be satisfied because we are still far from having an answer. But this is a question that perhaps goes beyond mere scientific data and focuses on existential and philosophical issues. We should first understand what life is. In this area, there are many definitions that vary depending on the matter we question. But let us take as an example the definition of NASA, which reads as follows. Life is a self-sufficient chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution. Although this definition is useful to recognize life on other planets and include potential forms of life that could not fall into the traditional categories based on terrestrial biology, it does not fully satisfy our conception of life. Let us think, for example, of a lion. We need to see if it reproduces to know that it is alive. And if there was only one lion in the world, it would still be considered alive, regardless of its ability to reproduce. Another way to define life could be through the ability of a system to perform actions with a specific purpose. For example, analyzing the world of the microscope, we see that bacteria, when exposed to a new type of sugar, begin to produce enzymes to metabolize it. This ability to adapt and respond to the environment can be described as a chain of complex causal events. But a simpler and more intuitive explanation could be that the bacteria is simply doing what is necessary to survive and is adapting its structure to this purpose. So can we say that an element that distinguishes life is that of having a predetermined end goal? In fact, even simple systems can have a purpose. Let us think of the network of a river basin, which over time modifies the path to optimize the flow of water and make sure that it flows into valleys without obstacles. This could also appear to be a purpose. But can we say that this is a living creature? Obviously not. The purpose we attribute to the cell or the river basin is only a projection of the human mind, a way to interpret and make sense of what we do not understand. The true and most profound need of man is to explain the world and find solutions for everything that seems incomprehensible to him. These considerations bring us back to the starting point of the video and to the beginning of our research. And at this point, we cannot help but ask ourselves, when we go to discover the origin of life, can our research be entrenched in our need to explain? Observing an extremely improbable phenomenon and looking for elements that can explain it, beyond the fact that these are actually real or not, can lead us to find an explanation only because this could technically work and therefore make the phenomenon explainable and more acceptable to our eyes. As we said before, this is what in some ways happened with the scientific research of the origins of life. If in the 1950s and 1970s we had placed a lot of trust in random events that would have given rise to life, today, having understood the improbability of this event, we are looking for physical and chemical laws that make this improbability more acceptable. But are we doing this to find the origin of life or to find something that pleases our concerns? The theory of natural selection, as explained by adaptation, is certainly one of the deepest truths of science, but it has a limited field of application. Natural selection explains very well how the lines already drawn may have been traced, but not how they were drawn. Among all the forms of life we know, man is the only living being who has the need to understand and explain the reality that surrounds him. Will we one day be able to understand the origins of life? Will we be able to go beyond our limits and reveal the truth about what and who we are? What do you think? Let us know in the comments your opinion. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the new videos. See you next time. Hi, I'm John. Our journey into mystery continues. If you want to uncover more hidden truths and answers to the greatest enigmas, leave a like, subscribe, and hit the bell. Together we'll explore the unknown. And who knows what secrets we'll find.